And never mind. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kendra O'Neill, the Director of Diversity and Community Engagement for Hill Learning Center. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our last community education series for this school year. We are thrilled to have such a diverse group of participants joining us, from educators and families here in Durham, North Carolina, to those tuning from across the country. Thank you for being a part of this important conversation. At Hill Learning Center, we are committed to engaging and educating on topics that impact students with learning and attention challenges. Since 1977, Hill has been a hub for research-based practices, professional development, and student support, ensuring that all learners, regardless of their school setting or formal diagnosis, receive the instruction and resources they need to thrive. Tonight, we are honored to spotlight ADHD in adolescent girls, a topic that has long been underrecognized and misunderstood. To guide us through this discussion, we have an incredible panel of experts from the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD, the nation's first academic program dedicated to studying ADHD in females. Dr. Julia Schechter, a licensed clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Duke University School of Medicine, conducts research, provides clinical care, and trains future professionals at the Duke ADHD Program. In 2021, she co-founded the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD to address the unique challenges faced by females with ADHD. Dr. Maura S. DeVito, a developmental psychologist and assistant professor at Duke University School of Medicine, specializes in neurodevelopmental disorders, particularly ADHD and autism in young children. She oversees daily operations at the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD, mentoring students and volunteers dedicated to the center's mission. Mayla Gillum, a second-year Master of Public Health student specializing in health behavior, brings both academic expertise and personal experience with ADHD to her work at the center, with a focus on advancing equitable and evidence-based care. Together, they will shed light on how ADHD presents in adolescent girls, the unique risks of undiagnosed ADHD, and the critical role of executive functioning in daily life. They will also share practical strategies to help girls with ADHD thrive at home, in school, and beyond. We deeply appreciate the work each of you does in supporting young people, and we're grateful for your time tonight. Throughout the event, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat. We will reserve time at the end for discussion. Let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schechter, Mayla Gillum, and Dr. Maura DeVito.
All right. Can you all see my screens okay? Or my slides okay? Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for inviting us to speak tonight. We are really excited to be here. And you do have the three of us. We have a whole team here tonight. And really what we're going to talk about is ADHD and executive functioning challenges and ways to support adolescent girls with ADHD. And we're going to bring our unique professional and personal experiences to this conversation. So as was just mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I assess and provide therapeutic services to individuals with ADHD across the lifespan. Dr. DeVito is going to bring her expertise in child development and executive functioning coaching to the conversation, and Mayla Gillum will bring her public health lens and her background, her scientific background to the conversation. And we're really, really glad that Mayla could be here with us tonight. She was one of our practicum students last year and was really instrumental in developing the concept for this talk. So we're glad she can join us. So again, you have a whole team tonight from the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD, and this is what we plan to cover. Here we go. So we're going to start out by talking a little bit just about ADHD generally, and then we're going to dive into how this can look different potentially in girls and women. Then we'll talk about executive functioning and its connection to ADHD and the brain more broadly. And then we're going to talk about understanding and building practical executive functioning skills that can support youth with ADHD. And then we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end. So we wanted to start with some scenarios and see if these sounded familiar to you. Your daughter has a lot of homework she needs to get done for this week. While she finishes her 5 math problems, she left her important 10-page essay until the day before it was due, and now she has to rush to finish it. Your daughter may perform well at school and is high achieving. People might say your daughter has it all together. However, when you ask her to do kind of seemingly simple things like set the dinner table, she starts crying and yelling, and the task just feels like too much for her. Or maybe this scenario, especially if you're an educator, your female student often misses instructions because she's easily distracted by friends and doodling all over her jeans. But you hadn't considered ADHD before because she isn't hyperactive and she doesn't disrupt the classroom. So we want you to hold these scenarios in your mind, and we're going to come back to these later on in the conversation to talk about some practical strategies to support these girls. But first, we want to talk about how these presentations might actually be related to ADHD. So I actually do want to start by introducing our center a little bit more. So we are the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD. We sit within the Duke School of Medicine, within the Department of Psychiatry, and then we're embedded within the Duke ADHD program, which was actually founded in the 1980s. Our center was founded in 2021, and the funds for our center have come primarily from a family who made a generous donation to fund the center. They have a personal connection to ADHD, and they wanted to fund a place that was really focused on providing evidence-based and information to individuals across the country. And their funds have really allowed us to focus on 3 main initiatives. One is education, and this is providing evidence-based information about girls and women with ADHD to the public, to educators, to parents, to medical providers. We also have an initiative focused on outreach, and this is really ensuring bi-directional communication and connections with community members, especially lived experience individuals. And research. And really there, as we will talk about tonight, there is a lot less research focused on girls and women with ADHD. We really want to be contributing to this growing area of research. All of this is in the service of our central mission, which is to enhance the lives of girls and women living with ADHD and the people who love them. Our pillars of our work are really kind of making sure that our work is evidence-based, female-focused, and equity-informed. And when I say equity-informed, I'm really talking about making sure that we're aware of who's been historically marginalized in ADHD research and address these inequities in our work. And all of those 3 pillars are kind of swimming in the soup of being really experience-based. So making sure that what we're doing is really speaking to the experiences that girls and women with ADHD are really living. I do want to make the point that the Duke Center for Girls and Women does not provide clinical care, so we don't provide therapeutic services or medication management. What we aim to do is really support communities, clinicians and communities members or clinicians in their own communities so they're able to do this work wherever they may be located. The Duke ADHD program does provide some clinical care, but we at the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD do not. So the kinds of things that we do is that we develop educational and resources that live on our website. We also promote information on our social media. So these are resources that we have developed, or we also really see ourselves as a clearinghouse for other good information. And so we love to amplify great work that's being done across the world related to ADHD in girls and women. And this is our team, or some of our team. We're a small but mighty team of researchers and clinicians and public health experts. We have lived experience community members who advise us and have a really wonderful group of volunteers. And we're all working together, again, to really promote the center's mission. I also want to make a couple other points. The center is committed to enhancing the lives of all individuals who identify as female, regardless of their sex assigned at birth. And just acknowledge right up front in this talk that you may hear us use terms like girls and women, which refer to gender, or terms like female, which refer to biological sex. And we may use some of these terms interchangeably just for simplicity, but we recognize that sex and gender are distinct concepts and that neither are binary. So why do we need a whole center focused specifically on girls and women with ADHD? Well, for a long time, girls and women with ADHD have been misdiagnosed with other psychiatric conditions, which can delay the accurate diagnosis of ADHD. Oftentimes, there's a lot of misunderstanding of what ADHD looks like in girls and women with ADHD, and this is misunderstanding by society, health professionals, educators, families. And all of this leads to missed opportunities to really reduce the negative long-term outcomes that can occur when ADHD is not identified or properly managed. Before we dive in more specifically to girls and women with ADHD, I want to just briefly talk about ADHD more broadly. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It means it has to do with how the brain is developing. And to meet criteria for ADHD, you have to show really significant atypical levels of inattention or hyperactive impulsive behavior, or both, right? Really something that's different than what would be expected for your developmental level. In addition, those symptoms have to be causing some kind of impairment. They have to be messing things up in some way. There are different types of ADHD, and the type that you get diagnosed with or the presentation you get diagnosed with depends on which symptoms are most prominent. What causes ADHD? We don't actually know. There are a lot of things that have been researched related to this. So the most commonly researched predictors of ADHD are things like pre and perinatal factors like preterm birth or prenatal exposures, environmental toxins like lead exposure, dietary factors, or kind of early life psychosocial stressors like trauma. But all of these studies really show more correlations rather than causality, or they don't necessarily show that they cause ADHD. Really what we find is that ADHD is most likely caused by genes. And so actually we find that around 25 to 55% of kids with ADHD have a parent with ADHD. So if you're on the call here for your child, you may hear some similarities with yourself potentially. And what we ultimately really know is that this is a gene by environment interaction that we're likely seeing. So genes are definitely a part of it, but there's also an environmental piece that plays a role. When we start to think about ADHD prevalence, so just to back up a second, ADHD prevalence generally is around 10% for kids in the general population, around 6% or so in adults. When we think about when ADHD is diagnosed, however, there's a real difference in terms of boys versus girls and men and women. So in childhood, boys are around 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD compared to girls. But interestingly, when you get to adulthood, this evens out. So men and women are just as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. We don't know exactly why that is. There's likely multiple reasons, but one of the reasons likely has to do with how ADHD tends to show up in girls and women with ADHD. So, for example, what we find is that oftentimes girls and women have more of those inattentive symptoms compared to hyperactive and impulsive behavior. So, when I say inattentive symptoms, I'm talking about more difficulty with sustaining attention, disorganization, trouble staying focused, those kinds of things. They absolutely can have the hyperactive and impulsive symptoms, but oftentimes their symptoms are a little bit more subtle. They're not quite as overt as what we often think about and see in boys. In addition, we often see more hyperverbal behavior like talkativeness rather than that kind of hyperactive behavior like the ants in the pants kind of symptoms that you might think of. Girls and women with ADHD also often have co-occurring conditions along with ADHD. So things like internalizing disorders like anxiety or depression. This can make it really tricky to kind of parse apart what is ADHD versus something else. What we often find too is that girls with ADHD tend to show symptoms later than boys with ADHD. So a little bit later in childhood is when they usually become more apparent. There's also some indication that they may be more apparent at times of transition. So when transitioning to puberty, for example, or when starting a new school year. We also have some indication that they may be more likely to mask their symptoms. Sometimes we call them master maskers, right? They're really, really good at covering up their difficulties, and they come up with these really elaborate coping strategies to kind of to not show to others what they might be experiencing internally. Data from population-based studies, primarily in Europe, actually, but they show that girls and women with ADHD are often diagnosed around 4 to 5 years later than boys and men. And they're significantly more likely to be diagnosed in adulthood compared to boys and men. And we also know that there's a lot of challenges when we start to weave in and layer on other demographic factors. So identifying ADHD in Black and African American communities and Hispanic communities is especially challenging. I want to go through this slide and talk a little bit about the impairment that we sometimes see with ADHD in girls and women. I mentioned impairment is part of the diagnosis. You have to see that ADHD is kind of getting in the way in some capacity. As I go through this slide, I just want you to kind of bring your attention to, at the bottom, you'll see some of these studies that I'm presenting are in comparison to girls and women without ADHD, and some are in comparison to boys and men with ADHD. So for example, we know that girls and women with ADHD have higher rates of neurodevelopmental conditions like autism, and this is in comparison to girls and women without ADHD. Also internalizing problems like depression and anxiety, externalizing problems like oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, eating disorders, intimate partner victimization, teenage and unplanned pregnancy, self-harm, suicide attempts, and suicide, and also higher rates of premature death. I know this is a really heavy slide to see, and I think the good news about this is that we have interventions that can really help to mitigate these risks, and we're going to talk about those today as well. But I think it is important to highlight that being a female diagnosed with ADHD does come with some additional and unique risks. There are two areas that we wanted to focus on tonight, kind of two topics that we want to dive into a little bit more tonight since we are focused on adolescence. The first one has to do with peers. We know, oops, I think I accidentally hit pause. Hold on. I'm going to bring this down for 1 second, then reshare. But I'll keep talking. So what we know is that, okay, that should show. What we know is that unfortunately, girls with ADHD do tend to have more peer problems compared to those without ADHD. Here we go. So for example, girls with ADHD experience more difficulties in friendships. They have challenges in their social skills. They're at risk for increased bullying. If we think about it, some of the ADHD symptoms that you might think about being at play here are things like, speaking without, first really thinking through what you're going to say, or missing social cues, or just being a little bit more socially naive, or having trouble keeping up with friends who text you or meeting up with friends on time. We also know that girls with ADHD who experience more hyperactivity and emotional dysregulation may have even additional harms in their relationships with peers. And when they have co-occurring conditions along with ADHD, we know this puts them at especially high risk for peer difficulties. In addition, these peer challenges may be underlying some of those impairments that I said just in the last slide as well. The other area that we wanted to mention in particular, since we're talking about adolescence, is hormones. Hormones are often starting to come into play when we think about adolescence. And interestingly, we do have some emerging literature connecting ADHD symptoms to hormone levels, specifically estrogen. So we want to share a little bit about this emerging research with you tonight. So one thing we know is that estrogen is a reproductive hormone, and it fluctuates across the course of the menstrual cycle, and it also fluctuates across the reproductive lifespan as well. And what researchers have shown is that low estrogen seems to be associated with worse ADHD symptoms. In addition, hormonal fluctuations just generally, as well as especially declining estrogen, seem to be associated with worse ADHD symptoms. So in puberty, for example, what they found is that it does seem that ADHD seems to be an increased time for increased impairment, and that as girls move through puberty, they seem to have more ADHD difficulties compared to boys moving through puberty. Another study had college-age students think back to when they were adolescents and think about ADHD symptoms, and they found that those who went through puberty earlier had greater ADHD symptoms. We're going to show you some more things on this slide just to give you a flavor of how some of this research that's coming out is looking at estrogen levels and across time and how those relate to ADHD symptoms. Though I realize we're really focused on adolescence, but Your adolescents are going to turn into adults one day. So when we think about kind of the premenopausal period when women are kind of having typical uh, uh, hormonal changes across their menstrual cycle, what some research out of the University of Kentucky has shown is that that low estrogen state has been linked to poor ADHD symptoms, while higher estrogen has shown times when ADHD symptoms are not as impairing. When we think about the perinatal period, so this is when people may be pregnant or postpartum, what they find is that women with ADHD tend to have more mood-related challenges at this time. So they're at higher risk for postpartum depression as well as postpartum anxiety. And then in the peri and postmenopausal phase, what they find is that just generally estrogen loss seems to put women at risk, higher risk for psychiatric symptoms, so things like depression. In one research group has been looking at executive functioning challenges in this time period and found that giving women this time stimulant medication, which is the frontline treatment for ADHD, this really improved their executive functioning challenges. Now, this wasn't a specific group of ADHD women, but it is interesting to kind of think more about this. And given that we are spending a lot of our time of life in the postmenopausal period, this is definitely an area of research that we're excited to look into more. So let's talk about a little bit about treatment. And before I pass this off to my colleagues, I want to talk a little bit about the evidence base that we have for different kinds of treatment. First, there's a lot of stuff out there that claims to help ADHD, but really doesn't have conclusive evidence. So things like chiropractic treatments, food allergy treatments, play therapy, none of that has been shown to help with ADHD, at least when we're looking really an evidence-based or research-based. Some emerging evidence has found that computer-based working memory training, digital therapeutics, biofeedback, mindfulness meditation, that does have some emerging evidence to potentially support its use in managing ADHD. But really what our research has told us is that medication management and psychosocial or behavioral interventions, those are really what we find has the strongest evidence base for supporting individuals with ADHD. And what we really find is actually the combination of those two is going to have the largest effect. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So first, medication. Typically, when we're thinking about medication, we're thinking about stimulant medication. And we found that ADHD medication is highly effective at helping to manage ADHD symptoms and reduce ADHD-related impairment. Stimulant medication is the frontline treatment that's recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics for individuals with ADHD ages 6 and above. And again, as I mentioned, medication combined with behavior therapy is really where we find the most impact. We don't have a lot of studies looking specifically at girls and medication and if they might have differential effects. There was one review in 2020, and they found that potentially some effects of differential effects of medication. So maybe differences in the timing of the medication or if it's a non-stimulant versus a stimulant. What we do have evidence to show is that girls with ADHD are prescribed medication less often than boys with ADHD, which is really interesting. I want to talk a little bit more about different types of behavioral therapy that can be effective when we're thinking about ADHD. So I'm going to show this on the next slide. But one point I want to make here is that there are not currently any recommendations for sex-specific ADHD treatment approaches. In other words, our treatments at the moment are not going to differ based upon someone's sex or gender. What I want to talk a little bit here is, before I pass it along, is kind of the framework that we often use in behavioral therapy. So what I have on the screen here is what we call our ABC model, antecedent behavior consequence. And we really use this model quite often in a behavioral intervention called behavioral parent management training. And behavioral parent management training has been the most researched behavioral intervention for ADHD. And this is really what we use most often in terms of behavioral therapy for younger kids, kind of elementary school age kids. And I know today we're talking a little bit more about adolescents, so I won't spend too much time here, but I do think this framework applies across the lifespan. So I want to take a little bit of time to break it down. So when we're thinking about antecedent, what we're really thinking about here is considering what is going on before a behavior happened. And what could you anticipate knowing your child or knowing your student based on your previous experiences? And how might you be able to potentially kind of set the stage for a certain behavior to be more likely to occur? The behavior is what your kid does. So that's what they do. Consequence is just what comes after a behavior. So usually when we think consequence, we think negative, but what in this model, what we really want to think about is just whatever happens next, positive, negative, neutral, and how does that consequence impact the frequency or intensity or presence of that behavior? And so this kind of model really underlies a lot of our different behavioral approaches of just trying to raise awareness of what's going on in the environment that might be impacting a certain behavior. So I mentioned parent management training is really what we recommend for elementary school age students. When we start to get into middle school and high school age students, we start to think about more around organizational skills training. So this is going to be pretty similar to the kinds of coaching approaches that Dr. DeVito will mention in just a moment. But I just want to talk a little bit about what we do in this kind of intervention. We really think about externalizing the problems that kids are having as glitches, trying to really separate them from what might be going on in their brain. We talk a lot about practical skills. So how do we organize materials, track assignments, plan, problem solve, time management, that kind of thing. We think about overlearning skills to really promote consistency. And we talk about contingencies. We'll think about that as sort of rewards, right? Like, okay, if my child's able to bring home their homework folder, every night, like, can I give some reward as their parent, for example? So those are the kinds of strategies that we might use in this intervention. I know today we're not talking as much about school-based interventions, but I did just want to briefly mention that there certainly are school-based interventions for students with ADHD. Just generally, we know that students really benefit from school staff that is knowledgeable about ADHD, flexible in their teaching style, and really, again, kind of separating the problems that we might see in behavior from the child themselves. We know that providing psychoeducation to teachers around ADHD can be really helpful for them just increasing their understanding and their empathy for the situations kids might be in. One intervention at school that's school-based that we do have some more research to support is something called a daily report card. This is where we identify certain behaviors and track their frequency and give, again, contingencies, give rewards for certain behaviors occurring. I'm sure a lot of people on this call are familiar with more kind of formal interventions like IEPs and 504 plans, but we do try to think about, are there either formal or informal accommodations that could be put into a classroom to really help students with being able to meet expectations more consistently. Today, however, we're going to be talking about executive functioning and executive functioning coaching and those kinds of approaches. So why are we talking about that? So we're talking about this, and I'm going to let Mela in just a moment take away my slides. But first, we're talking about executive functioning difficulties because they're really common in ADHD. And Mela's going to talk about the frequency and how this is connected to the ADHD brain. Right now, EF, or executive functioning training and coaching, is not currently one of those evidence-based interventions that I just had on the screen, but it does draw on the similar principles as parent management training and other evidence-based treatments like the ones I mentioned. We also really wanted to provide some practical tips today to parents and teachers that can target these EF challenges and and that are common in ADHD. We want you to feel like you have something that you can do to help support your daughter or your students, and don't have to be a trained mental health professional necessarily to do it. And so that's really our sort of the driving force behind kind of what we're going to transition to talking about now. So I'm going to go ahead and take down my slides, and Mila, I'll let you go ahead and share.
Hey, sounds good. Can we see the slides? Okay, cool. Thank you. So I wanted to say a big thanks to Julia for taking us through what I would like to call like a grand tour of ADHD and treatments for ADHD. But now I'm going to dive a little bit more into executive functioning and the ADHD brain. So before we begin, I want y'all to think back on those first examples that Julia gave at the beginning of the presentation of some potential experiences girls with ADHD may have faced. So all of those experiences that were discussed previously have one thing in common, and they're all examples of executive functioning challenges for girls with ADHD. Before we dive into executive functions, I first wanted to give y'all a definition of executive functioning, which we also call EF, so that we can all be on the same page when we say this term. So, executive functions are a set of brain-based skills that are required for humans to effectively execute or perform tasks and solve problems. Well, this is a generalized definition of executive functions. We're going to be diving a lot deeper into what they are and the neurobiological basis for these functions, and how they may manifest for your daughter and things that you can do to help build and bolster these skills. So, when I say executive functions, I'm talking about a collection of 12 key brain-based functions. So, these executive functions include working memory, planning and prioritizing, organization, time management, metacognition, response inhibition, emotional control, sustained attention, task initiation, goal-directed persistence, flexibility, and stress tolerance. So these executive functions, while there are a good amount of them, we'll only be diving into a few today, and you'll figure out why in a few minutes. But these executive functions are developed across the lifespan, and they especially are developed during the time in adolescence when our brain is maturing. But an important question to ask is, why do executive functions matter? Like Julia said, oh, this isn't like an evidence-based treatment, but why do we want to talk about them today? So the first thing is that EFs matter for everybody, not just for people with ADHD. It's a really important thing to talk about because training on this scale is really important because it helps us it helps us function and perform these necessary daily tasks. So executive functions help us set, navigate, and meet deadlines, daily routines, and schedules. They help us set, meet, and navigate appointments, events, activities. They may help us be successful students, complete paperwork, or fulfill the duties of our jobs. They help us start and complete our chores, clean and organize. They help us overcome distractions and manage competing demands. And they help us with emotion regulation, being able to navigate situations. So all these examples are to say that there's not one area of your life in which EFs matter. They matter to every aspect of your life. And this is even more relevant for teens with ADHD. They're finally developing the EFs to allow them to manage these activities independently, and it's up to us to help foster this growth even when it's difficult for people with ADHD. So now that we have an understanding of EF, how do they relate to ADHD in girls, and the development of the brain? So we know that EF delays are transdiagnostic or overarching features of neurodevelopmental conditions. And one of those neurodevelopmental conditions is ADHD. So executive functioning is up to 30% or 3 years delayed in individuals with ADHD. This is particularly important to remember when we start talking about the trajectory of brain development, differences in the ADHD brain, and outcomes for girls with ADHD. Well, this is a specific statistic. Statistics are not the only thing that tells us that executive functioning is delayed in individuals with ADHD. So parents and teachers consistently note these delays as well, with children with ADHD being rated as having more executive skill weaknesses than their peers. While there's evidence that states that executive functioning is delayed in teens with ADHD, not all teens with ADHD view their skills this way. So teens with ADHD are known to overestimate their executive functioning ability and are more likely to say that they are confident in their executive skill performance. This indicates that teens may not even know that anything is wrong with their level of EF, but we know that you may be aware that they have some challenges. So through the information and tips that we provide for you today, you can help your teen help themselves and build and foster these necessary executive functions. Okay, so before we fully get into the information about how executive function develops, it is helpful to have a broad understanding of the brain itself and its function, since we're going to be diving a lot deeper into these parts of the brain in the next slide. So first, we have the parietal lobe. This lobe of the brain integrates sensory information such as touch, temperature, pressure, and pain. Next, we have the occipital lobe, which is in the bottom left, and that's the visual processing center of the brain containing the primary visual cortex, processing, obviously, the information from our eyes. Third, we have the frontal lobe, and this is the part of the brain that is in charge of what we call higher order or more complex executive functions, such as emotional regulation, planning, reasoning, and problem solving. This part of the brain also controls our movements. And then finally, we have the temporal lobe, and this part of the brain is dedicated to processing sensory information. It's critical for hearing and recognizing language, but also most importantly for memory formation and learning. Okay, so now that we've talked about those brain regions, let's dive a little bit more into how these regions mature and develop and how those are related to ADHD. So to the right, you can see an image of a developing brain, and it's going from the age of 5 to 20 plus, which is why there's an arrow at the end. The gradient indicates maturity. So the blue areas are more mature, and the red and pink areas are the least mature. And you can see how the brain is typically the least mature at the age of 5 and is moving towards the most mature as you get to age 20. So in late adolescence, the brain is rapidly maturing. The first thing to mature is facial perception, and this begins maturing around the age of 5, but it really is probably solidified in our late adolescence. The frontal areas and frontal lobes that are associated with critical thinking and planning develop through the teenage years, but these start around the age of 12 and mature through our early 20s. However, the temporal lobe, which is again associated with learning and memory, is among the last of our brain regions to mature and is still maturing well into our 20s. So this maps on with the development of executive functioning skills. As I said, there are two categories of EF skills, the first of which is our basic or skills that develop earlier in the process of brain maturation. These skills are things such as response inhibition, response preparation, and working memory, and are associated with the frontal lobe. So there are also higher order or later developing skills, such as planning and shifting, that are associated with the parietal lobe. And while we know that executive function develops, research suggests that there's a differential trajectory in terms of executive functioning development and brain development for kids with ADHD. Kids with ADHD may experience a delay in the development of these skills based on the trajectory of our brain development, so it just might take kids with ADHD a little bit longer to develop these skills. It's not to say that they're never going to do it. A 3-year delay should not scare you. It is just a brain difference for people with ADHD. So while there is a general pattern of development of executive functions and lobe development for all individuals, there are specific sex differences that are important to bring up. So as a whole, girls and boys have different trajectories of brain development. There are prevalent sex differences in every lobe of the brain that are accompanied by overall global differences, such as the ratio of gray to white matter. This gray matter that I'm talking about, which is vaguely indicated by the orange star you see on your left, is actually the outside layer of the brain, and it helps us process and transmit information, and it controls movement, memory, and emotion. This can be contrasted to the white matter, which is the inside layer of the brain, which I couldn't indicate with this star, but white matter connects brain regions to each other and helps with learning, attention, and motor control. It's said that gray matter finishes developing in your 20s, while white matter actually peaks during middle age. So, as I said, there are sex differences in brain development. Girls' frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes and their total cerebral gray matter volume mature 1 to 3 years earlier than their male peers. So, this is especially interesting when we think back to EF delay among individuals with ADHD, indicating that it may be necessary to examine behavioral development and EF development in boys and girls separately to actually appreciate the deficits that are different between girls with ADHD and boys. Okay, so all of this is to say that EF dysfunction is common among individuals with ADHD, and there's some evidence to indicate that it is especially relevant for girls. I do want to state that this is a blossoming area of research. So what we have here is the current research, but we would love to have more research come in the future to really solidify how to best help girls with ADHD. But it has been noted that girls with ADHD struggle with executive functions regardless of their academic achievement. And I have this thing that says no one is immune from executive functioning struggles if you're a girl with ADHD. There is evidence that girls with ADHD may struggle more with planning than boys with ADHD. This is also reported widely across studies and indicates that there's a fundamental difference in the brain of girls with ADHD compared to boys. This is also why planning will be discussed by Maura a little bit later in this talk. Should be noted that girls with ADHD who struggle with inhibition may be at risk for more negative outcomes, such as the ones that Julia mentioned earlier, indicating that executive functioning struggles should be taken seriously for girls with ADHD. Finally, executive functioning deficits are seen to continue across the lifespan, even if ADHD symptoms improve. So it can be surmised that even after the brain finishes its development, these EF deficits persist. All of these things demonstrate that EF deficits are incredibly salient for girls with ADHD, and skills training to help improve these EF skills should be prioritized. Okay, so I know that I just threw a lot of information at you about the brain and outcomes for girls with ADHD, and I talk really fast. So please make sure to put comments in, to add your comments to the chat so that we can answer those later too if I went through anything too fast. But I do want to say, I already said this, but delays in EF does not mean that girls with ADHD cannot or will not develop these skills. Again, our brain is constantly on this developmental trajectory, and adolescence is a sensitive period for development. And while girls with ADHD may take a little bit more time to develop these skills, they're capable of developing them, especially with additional help and some EF training that we're going to talk about today. I also want to note that the brain isn't the only thing that influences our development of executive functions. As Julia mentioned previously, there is usually a gene by environment interaction in the development of ADHD. This is also true for executive functions and self-regulation. Things such as the rate of neural maturation, structural brain changes, puberty and biological changes, and even our social, cultural, and socioeconomic contexts can influence the development of EFs and self-regulation. But this is why it's so important to discuss EFs and look at ways to build them in our girls. When we talk about adolescence, this is a particularly sensitive period for teens and developing executive functioning and self-regulation skills. And so it's important to utilize some environmental or practical strategies to use with your girls. In just a moment, Maura will walk you through some strategies that you can all use to support your girls. But before this, we wanted to share with you some experiences from girls with ADHD. I also wanted to share with you that throughout this presentation, a lot of the examples that are shared come from my own lived experience of being a woman and a former teen diagnosed with ADHD. So just know your teens are not alone. I have experienced them. I think it's pretty common, but it is crucial to hear from individuals who have lived experience because it allows us to internalize this factual information and put skills into practice. So now I'm going to pass it over to Julia, and she's going to go through some of these experiences with you.
Thanks, Mela. So as Dr. DeVito gets her slides queued up, one of the things we wanted to share with you is putting some actual voices to what Mela was just describing. The Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD was really fortunate to receive funding from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI. And what we were able to do with this funding was to hold kind of focus groups and actually talk to girls with ADHD, their parents, educators, different voices and people in their community. And we asked them, like, what are your experiences? What are your pain points to really learn from them? And what we wanted to share was a couple of quotes with you guys today from parents as well as a teen girl themselves and then an educator as well. So this first one, this is from a parent of an 8-year-old girl. It's part of executive functioning. You cannot self-regulate your emotions if you're developmentally delayed in executive functioning. So that's why if something goes wrong, they're not able to see past that. So then that leads to the difficulty regulating their emotions. This next quote is from a parent of a 12-year-old girl. She says, one of her biggest challenges right now is with that executive functioning thing. And she's got a private coach we're working with and we're doing a lot, but still just her perception of time and understanding. You know how that is affecting so much of her day and her ability to plan and move forward. This next is from a teen girl herself. So yeah, I think like executive function, like that, just time management and like especially within high school. And we have so many things to think about. Like it can be hard to manage it and it can be hard to manage it like correctly, even if you're trying to, like for me, I've always found that it takes longer. I'll get distracted and then it just ends up running late. Then we've got another parent here. This is of a teen girl. But so there was always this incredible disconnect between her pretty high intelligence and precociousness and her capabilities, which now I would call her executive functioning capabilities. Something was always lost. She didn't remember the assignment. The teacher would say at parent day, just so you know, we spent 20 minutes discussing what that homework assignment is. And then I would come home with her and she'd say, yeah, well, he didn't tell us, or it's something different, but every single day. This last quote is from an educator. This educator says, she is 15 and one of her biggest challenges that she faced in the regular education classroom was just executive functioning in general, getting started on tasks, being able to stay on task, not being distracted in the classroom by all the other stuff going on in the classroom. She always felt more comfortable when I would pull her out and, work with her in a small group or one-on-one where she felt like she could slow down and, take a breath and kind of let her mind wander for a little bit before we continued on with whatever the task was. So I'm going to pass it off to Dr. DeVito, who's going to talk a little bit more about how parents and educators can support girls who might have these presentations.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, so this is the last leg of this talk, and I hope everybody's hanging in there because I know it's late in the evening. So far, we've reviewed some of the research on adolescent development in general and the brain and how it works with executive functioning during adolescence. We've talked a little bit about ADHD and how it shows up in girls. And Julia ended with these powerful quotes on the lived experiences of girls with ADHD and their parents and caregivers. So now I'd like to share some tips and strategies to support the emerging executive function skills that are happening during adolescence. There is not enough time to cover all 12 executive skills that Mela talked about earlier. So I've just chosen 3 that I think are relevant to teens in general during this period of time, and maybe particularly relevant to girls with ADHD. So the ones that I'll cover tonight are planning and prioritizing, metacognition, and emotional control. I work with various girls in high school, college, young adulthood, and I tend to work on particularly planning and prioritizing and metacognition. But I'm also aware that emotional control comes up behind the scenes in everyday family life a lot and could be a challenge for parents and families to work with. So first, planning and prioritizing. So for each of these sections, I'll give a little definition and some examples, maybe share a little bit of research, and talk about a few tips that I've used in my coaching of various girls. So planning and prioritizing first, that's the ability to create a roadmap, to reach a goal or to complete a task. It also involves being able to make decisions about what is important to focus on and what is not. And that can be very hard. Here's an example. And I think we might have referenced this one earlier. Your daughter has a lot of homework she needs to get done for the week. And while she finishes her 5 math problems, she left her important 10-page essay until the day before it's due. And now she has to rush to start and finish it. While your daughter buys a planner every year before school, she never uses it to write down her assignments for the week. And then she gets overwhelmed at the number of assignments that need to be completed. Or maybe because she didn't write it down, she doesn't even know what things need to be completed and when. When you're struggling with that planning, you're sort of lacking that internal GPS to tell you what turns to make, when to make them, so that you reach your destination and you get there at the right time. And that can be really hard. So we need to support that skill, especially if, as Mela mentioned, you're talking about potentially a 3-year delay in some of these skills. So imagine a 13-year-old in 7th grade, maybe having some skills that are more like a 10-year-old who would be in 4th grade. The demands on a 7th grader are much greater than the demands on a 4th grader, and the skills might not be there yet to support and work through the demands. Okay, so what can we do to support this? So like I said, I think most often when I'm coaching, a lot of our sessions are focused on the planning and the prioritizing. It's sort of a, what's the landscape? What do we need to do for this week? What's on the horizon coming up? And how do we break this down? And so the first step that we usually do is define what the problem or the task is or the project, and then break it down into really small steps. It's really hard to start something when you don't know what all the steps are and which one to start with. So if there's an essay that needs to be written, the very first task might be, let's make an outline. If that's too overwhelming, it may be smaller than that. Task 2 might be write 1 paragraph, but if that's too overwhelming, it might be, okay, let's just write 1 sentence. And maybe we start it together so that you gather some momentum. So planning the what and really defining it in very specific actionable steps is key to the start of a planning, a good plan. Next, we want to talk about planning in terms of when. So we might know what to do, but the next question becomes, when do we do it and how long do we spend on it? So spending some time really scheduling each task is important, but not scheduling it just sort of in an ideal world if we had all the time. It needs to be scheduled and planned for in the context of a busy life of a middle schooler or a high schooler who maybe has like after school sports or activities and other family obligations and wants to spend time with friends. So if we look at any one night in a week, what is the actual chunk of time that we realistically have to spend some time doing that task? So then we want to get them to find those times and then commit to it. So when am I going to do this one specific task? Write one paragraph. And for how long can I and will I spend on that task? Okay. And then another important strategy to work on is prioritizing. Sometimes the list of to-dos is just so long and so varied. And that can be overwhelming and make it hard to make a plan and to know where to start. And that's where we might start to see some of that procrastination. It's just all too much and it's too overwhelming. I don't know where to start. Everything feels important. Everything feels like it was due yesterday. So let's make it concrete. Let's visualize it. Let's get it down on paper, on a screen, somewhere, so we can actually see what has to get done and what's the most important thing to start with. So we can use a task management tool like the Eisenhower matrix, or sometimes it's called a Covey quadrant, but it's basically just a 2x2 matrix looking at plotting out what is important, what is urgent, what is not important, and what is not urgent. And when you start to actually move the big, long to-do list into sections of this graph or into these quadrants, you start to see that what is important and urgent must get done first. And that's that green box. So you want to do the tasks with the deadlines or the consequences first. Whereas the tasks that are not urgent and not important, we want to delete because those are a distraction and they're stopping us from making progress in the green with the items that are in the green box. For the items that are important but not urgent, okay, we do need to get to them. Let's take a little moment to do some of that planning. What are we going to do and when are we going to do it so that we make progress toward that orange box of items? And then those things that are maybe urgent but not important, we delegate. The point is, for any of these strategies, when we make it concrete, when we make it visual, when we make it small, it starts to become a little easier to do. But we all need help with that sometimes to just make things less overwhelming and a little smaller. Now, I said I was only going to talk about 3 executive skills, which is true. However, I couldn't ignore the fact that task initiation can be a challenge sometimes. So, how do you start, even if you have a plan? For tasks or projects that are multi-step or long-term, even with a plan, it can be hard to start. So that's that other executive skill of task initiation. And these are just a couple of tips that I like to use when I'm coaching, and frankly, that I use on myself when a task feels really big or overwhelming, like when I have to write a research manuscript and there's so many parts and so many steps to it. So for example, you might want to help the team that you're working with to create a getting started routine or a checklist. So that means, like, what are all the things I need so that when the time comes for me to work in that work block that I've already planned and scheduled, I'm ready to go and I'm not spending the first 10 minutes then getting all the things ready. So like, I need my laptop, it needs to be charged. I need to know, open my files, I need to know where they are. If I have certain articles that I need to read for the essay, I have those pulled up. So it's just all the sort of rip the Band-Aid things that maybe if you just help them a little bit with the getting started and then they know the task, they can get going. And so scheduling time to do that, to initiate an effortful task, can really help. Body doubling is another thing that can help. And that's just really working alongside another person who's also working. So, if you're home and let's say you have work to do for your job, maybe you guys can sit next to each other, sit at the kitchen table or in the same space and just both be working. It just creates that feeling of not being alone and being focused and productive. I do this with colleagues. We do co-writing sessions over Zoom. So we have scheduled time. It's kind of like making a meeting with yourself and working alongside other people. It's what in the little kid realm we would call like parallel play, like 2 kids sort of playing alongside each other, not necessarily interacting, but each playing and being near each other. You can also pair it with something pleasant. So if it's a task that's a little bit hard, maybe something like writing, I like to light a candle, get a cup of tea, put on some instrumental music, and it just sort of brings down the anxiety level a little bit as I'm about to embark on an effortful task. And when our brain is calm, we can be more creative and more productive. Also, using a timer can really help with the time management piece. So it's not like, oh my God, I have this whole thing to write and I'm going to be here forever. No, you scheduled an hour for this. set a timer for an hour. When that goes off, it's done. Or maybe it realistically is more, I'm going to work for 25 minutes, then I'm going to take a 5-minute break. I'm going to check in with myself. And then I'm going to maybe do another 25 minutes. And that's like the time that I have to spend on this task. So just wanted to share a few getting started routines and ideas to help after you've made that plan. Okay. The next thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of an executive function skill is metacognition. And I think this one's really important because it is sort of like that last executive skill to come online, and it has a very protracted developmental timeline across adolescence. In other words, ADHD or not, all adolescents are building this skill. It's a very good time to be building this skill because there's so much opportunity with support to build this skill. So it's the ability to stand back and take a bird's eye view of oneself in a situation. It's also an ability to observe how you problem solve, and it includes self-monitoring and self-evaluative skills. Some examples of struggles that girls may face in metacognition. For example, your daughter repeatedly makes mistakes when doing math homework or taking a test, but they don't reflect on the nature of the mistakes. So instead, they just sort of hope it doesn't happen again and then repeat the same mistake again because it happens again, because I haven't taken the time to figure out what's the mistake, what went wrong, how can I make it better next time. That's metacognition. It's thinking about your processes and thinking about your behavior and monitoring it and readjusting. Your daughter doesn't really have a plan for studying for exams, or they just have one method. Oh, I'm going to review my notes. I'm going to study, but it doesn't work. They don't do well. They study and maybe they look at their notes for hours, but it doesn't work. And they don't realize that they need to try other methods. Maybe your daughter gets upset or anxious because of a stressful situation, but she's not aware of how her emotions are then negatively impacting decisions and actions. Or maybe she can identify her emotions. So she's like, I know I'm upset. I know I'm anxious. I know this doesn't feel good, but doesn't know why and doesn't know what will help and isn't reflecting on like strategizing. Well, how can I make this better for myself? So those are just a few examples of metacognition. So metacognition is important in adolescence because adolescence is a period of time in which self-awareness is emerging and developing. And again, metacognitive skills have a very protracted timeline of development over the teen years. In other words, perfect time to practice, 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 and get it right. Research has shown that awareness of task performance improves through adolescence and stabilizes in adulthood. So they looked at people between like 11 and 40, and there was really during that teen time, there was like rapid increases in metacognitive development. And females performed a little better in this skill, but it was a small sample. So larger samples are needed for that kind of research. And again, this was just adolescents in general. This wasn't looking at specifically ADHD. However, compared to children without ADHD, school-age children who've been researched who have ADHD show delays in metacognitive skills and in metacognitive skills related to, for example, emotion recognition. So there seems to be a bit of a tie between, or a connection between metacognitive skills and emotion skills. And in another study, children and young teens with ADHD may especially struggle with their metacognitive awareness and emotional resilience. So again, seeing a little bit of that connection because emotions are complicated and complex. And in the teen years, they can really be strong. The brain is reorganizing, as Mela explained, and emotions can get strong. And so building in that metacognitive skill and awareness can actually help to inform us and develop our emotional control and resilience as well. But moving along. Okay, so a few strategies for supporting metacognitive development. I think that parents, educators, adults can really work on, I think a lot of these strategies come to just sort of asking the question and also just modeling it in your own life. In my coaching sessions, I often have students who are just like, I have this to do and I have this to do and like, oh, I got this done and this went well. And I'm like, whoa, slow down. So I'm often asking them to slow down and put the brakes on and just reflect for a minute. And these are sort of the questions that I ask and the sort of strategies I use to get them to slow down, to really reflect. So the first thing is, if you're setting goals or making a plan, so maybe you're in that planning and prioritizing phase, or you're setting a goal, oh, I want to get my driver's license, whatever the goal is, name the obstacles, have the girl name the obstacles that may arise before or during the task that could potentially divert the goal or derail the plan, and help them problem solve before they occur. So if it's, I have a plan to do my homework between 4 and 5 o'clock, and I know what I'm going to work on, I made this whole plan. Maybe the obstacle could be that won't happen if, for example, the phone is in the room, because the phone is going to start buzzing and everybody's going to be texting and you're going to get distracted. So getting them to sort of anticipate what the obstacles could be to succeeding at that goal or plan, and then coming up with a problem solving strategy around that obstacle. That's building metacognitive skills. Reflect. So during and after trying a strategy or trying to execute a plan, modeling and practice asking, what worked? What didn't work? What did I learn? So I do this a lot in my sessions. We review from one session to the next, say, okay, how'd it go? We had this plan last time. Tell me what worked. Did you do the plan? How did it go? What worked for you? What didn't work for you? Because they're learning, and you want it to, I almost think of it as like a little research case study where you're learning. It's almost like they're piloting a strategy, like, oh, maybe it does work for me to work alone in my room, or maybe it doesn't, and I need to be downstairs in the kitchen with a little bit of, people and a little bit of noise going on. So it's just getting them to think through what works for me. It's building that self-awareness. And then adjust. So help improve processes and outcomes the next time by using that knowledge of what worked. So you name what worked, you name what didn't work. You want to increase the success. So then it becomes, what do I need to change or improve next time? So it didn't work to do my homework in my bedroom. I got distracted. I lost track of time. I started looking at a magazine or whatever, or my phone. Okay, maybe I need a different environment so that I focus more. So just simple little questions and strategies. And this next slide highlights a lot of the kinds of questions that I will ask to sort of elicit that metacognitive, sort of that monitoring of behavior, that solving problems, that evaluating performance. So I don't mean for this slide to overwhelm you. It's just to give you a few ideas of different ways to ask similar questions. Okay. And the last executive skill that I'm going to go over a little bit is emotional control. And this may be the hardest one. I think it probably is. It's not one that I necessarily address in coaching when I'm coaching one-to-one with a girl, because they're often bringing their best self, or maybe a little bit of anxiety that we can talk through. I think a lot of times the emotional dysregulation can happen in the home setting, in the family setting. And so this one's a little trickier, because this may be a matter of sort of getting coaching for a parent, or getting support for a parent to be able to most effectively work with the teen. Or maybe it's a dyadic thing. It's the parent and the teen getting some support together to start to build those skills. How can we support your emotional regulation? And that's hard, because in adolescence, they're trying to move away from parents, right? They're trying to build independence, and that's completely appropriate and developmentally good. And yet this support is still needed. And so that can be really tricky to manage. So I just want to honor that and say, yes, understood. This one's really tricky. Emotional control is the ability to manage emotions, to achieve goals, complete tasks, or control and direct behavior. So some examples potentially that may ring true for you or not. I think Julia might have mentioned this one before. Your daughter may perform well at school, seems all put together, is high achieving. People say, wow, she has it all together. However, when you ask her to set the table or do some chore at home, she explodes or breaks down and starts crying, because it's all just been too much. She's been holding it together all day, and there's just nothing left in the tank. You ask your daughter a question, you feel like everything is interpreted as an attack, or feels like a shouting match when you just really wanted to have a conversation and ask a question. Maybe you wanted to bring up a problem that you're noticing, something you're concerned about, but the response is silence, or turning inward, or retreating, or sort of the great old rolling of the eyes, which I experience and understand greatly as a parent. So these are some of the things that might happen. And again, adolescence is a time when emotions are running high, and they are up and down, and they are trying to they are experiencing a lot. So there's the added factor then that ADHD may make it a little bit more intense sometimes. And indeed, in the research, we see that emotional dysregulation in adults with ADHD is evidenced by heightened and dysregulated responses in the brain, in the frontal and centroparietal lobes. In another study, they showed that children and adolescents with ADHD showed atypical development in the brain's limbic system, the emotion network, and that this was associated with increased ADHD symptom severity. I was looking at this study today, and it was just reminding me that maybe the next time I experience it as a parent with, a teen sort of getting emotional, just tell myself limbic system, limbic system. It's going to be okay. It's just the limbic system. Teens with ADHD who experience greater emotional dysregulation may have more relationship problems with peers. That's another research study that found that. And finally, another research study looked at college-age females with ADHD and found that the best predictor of life dissatisfaction was poor emotional control. So across different studies, different groups, adults, children, teens with ADHD, females with ADHD, this thread of emotional dysregulation is very real and deserves some attention and support. So what can we do? Honestly, this dealing with emotional control and helping parents and caregivers is sort of probably a whole talk in and of itself. So I'm just giving a little nod to it. I will say that Dr. Margaret Sibley has a great website with resources about parent-child sort of relationships and navigating executive functioning and ADHD and parents and children, especially teens. She has some good resources, and I'll show those resources at the end a little bit. But here's just a couple of tips. So one thing, building connection. Connection creates a feeling of generally more positivity than not, and a feeling of general safety, just a good feeling in general. And then we know that children and teens with ADHD get corrected quite often. And so trying to balance out those many corrections with more positive experiences and more praise can go a long way. So there's sort of this 3-to-1 ratio. It's like for every correction, try to have 3 specific moments of praise. And we want them to be very, very positive, but very specific. So, maybe your daughter got upset because her sisters stole her favorite jewelry and then broke it or lost it. You can say something very specific, like you can just like catching the good, catching the positive, and just being very specific. Like, hey, I noticed that your sister took your earrings or broke your earrings, and that must have been really hard. I noticed that you took a deep breath and you used your words and said something to her, but you were able to manage that, and that must have been hard, and you really did it, and that was great. I'm really proud of you, or something. Or wow, you should be proud of yourself. Also, spending quality time together. Sorry, I didn't mean to click that last one. We'll go to that in a minute. Spend quality time together. So it can be hard as our teens get busier in their lives, doing more and more things outside the home with peers and activities. That's all super important for building their independence and their own social network. But it's still important to have quality time with them. And so maybe just sort of showing to them that they are important and you want that little bit of one-to-one time. It could be 5 minutes, or it could be an hour. It could be watching a show together that you both enjoy and talk about and laugh. Just sort of that downtime and enjoyable time. Or maybe it's going out together and getting a dessert or a coffee or whatever it is. But scheduling a little bit of that quality time, again, just to create a basis of connection, a basis of positivity, can go a long way to balance out those potentially more eruptive or difficult interactions and those moments. The next thing is just waiting to discuss. It's so hard to not launch into a lecture or correct during those moments of emotional difficulty, but there is no learning that will happen. Both people need to be calm, and so trying to discuss the situation at a later time when you've been distanced from that difficult interaction can go a long way in actually producing more positive effects down the road. And so maybe it means scheduling a weekly family meeting where you sort of reflect on the week. Again, that gives you a chance to build those metacognitive skills and to model that. Hey, what happened this week? What went well? What was hard? What can we learn from that? What do we want to be different this week ahead? Could go a long way. It builds a mutual realm of collaboration and problem solving together. and mutual sort of respect and listening. And finally, using active listening. That's that reflective listening to understand sort of your daughter's emotions and their responses and things like that. And so it's sort of just listening to what they say and reflecting back what you heard. So, for example, if your child says, I've been feeling really stressed at school lately, I have so many projects and so much homework and so much studying to do, and I have so many extracurriculars that I don't feel like I have enough time to get everything done. Just reflecting back is the first step. So it might be like, oh God, what do I do after all of that? I don't know how to problem solve that. Don't problem solve yet. Just start with reflecting back. It sounds like you're feeling overwhelmed with all the projects and the homework that you have, and just so much pressure with all your extracurriculars. It must be hard to manage all of that at once. It just brings things down a little bit, makes them feel heard, makes them feel acknowledged, and it gives a chance for clarification. So maybe if you're restating something they said, it actually helps them to better say, oh, wait, I didn't mean that. I actually meant this is how I feel. It gives a little chance for clarity. And it's just an opening to a conversation, and it'll eventually lead to problem solving. I know that those three things are really, really hard, and each one of them can be difficult, especially in a heightened moment. So again, just want to acknowledge that. Okay. So I'm going to just stop there and give a little summary and a couple of resources, and then we'll open it up to questions. So Julia started by talking about ADHD, and particularly ADHD in girls and women. She spoke about their unique presentation and set of challenges and outcomes, as well as evidence-based treatments and interventions for that. Mela highlighted executive functioning and the developmental phase of in adolescence for executive functioning, and highlighted how girls with ADHD, particularly in the adolescent period, may struggle with executive function. And then I tried to highlight a few skills in the area of planning and prioritizing, metacognition, and emotional regulation. We hope that this has been helpful, but there are many resources out there to continue to support you. Our Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD has a robust website of learning resources and terms and e-libraries. We have one for each of different age groups, because we are interested in the entire lifespan of girls and women. And so we have an e-library for adolescents ages 10 to 17, which gives different, podcasts, organizations, books, things that can support you. Again, I briefly touched on Dr. Margaret Sibley. She's a researcher who studies ADHD, and she has a whole process called STAND, Supporting Teens Autonomy Daily, and it's a parent-teen dyadic support intervention. And so there's a book on it that has like worksheets and things to build skills. She focuses a lot on motivational interviewing, which is a strategy to help sort of build that question and questioning, effective questions that you can ask teens to open up conversation and to have back and forth. It includes some parent training and helps with family conflict. And then other resources, I did my training for executive function coaching with Dr. Peg Dawson, who's amazing. She has a whole Smart But Scattered book series, and she also has a great website that has downloadable resources and things like that to support executive functioning for children and teens. And so those are some potential things that could support. And that is all I have.
Thank you so much to our panel of experts. We do have a few questions. I'd like to start with Dr. Schechter. Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned early puberty. What are the exact ages of early puberty in terms of your presentation?
Yes, thank you. I'd seen that question, and so for the study I mentioned, it was kind of relative early puberty, so they were looking within the sample that they were selecting. So it wasn't like this age was considered early puberty. There was a really great question about that study specifically. What I did want to bring in is actually another study that was looking at puberty timing and ADHD, and they did not find a difference between girls with ADHD and girls without ADHD. What I'm going to do is I was trying to put some things in the chat, and I'll put another resource in the chat. Mara had just mentioned on our website, which is ADHDgirlsandwomen.org. We have a bunch of different resources. One of the types of resources that we develop is something called a research spotlight. And these are where we summarize one page summaries of research studies. And we really sort of get to the meat of what was this? What was the study about? What were the findings? And here's why it matters to you. Our goal is to try to make science as accessible as we can to everybody. So I'm going to put in the chat in a moment one of our research spotlights that focused on pubertal timing and ADHD and its interaction with stimulant medication use. So I'll put that in the chat, and whoever had that question can take a look.
Thank you. And Dr. DeVito, do you have any resources you'd recommend on reflective listening? That was a question from our audience.
Yeah, so I think the ones that I put toward the end of the slides, like Dr. Margaret Sibley, she recommended a book on motivational interviewing, and a lot of that has some things related to reflective listening. And also Dr. Peg Dawson's book, Smart But Scattered, they talk a lot about sort of reflective and active listening in their book. So I would think that those books would have some parts to it that would be helpful for building that skill.
Okay. Do you have recommendations for talking to a 13-year-old girl who is against taking medication for her ADHD and how to explain its benefits?
I can start with this one, but I'm curious if my co-presenters have other ideas. But yeah, I mean, I guess just to start, that this is tricky. I thought that was really interesting. What Mela presented on is that adolescents are notoriously not great at reflecting on their own challenges. And that's not unique to ADHD. That's just kind of where they are in terms of brain development. There's another study that's similar to what Mela presented, where they actually did have, ADHD youth, and they had them take their medication on one day and not take their medication on another day, and then perform certain executive functioning tasks and other things. And the teens themselves said, well, I did the same on both days. But when they actually looked at the data, no, they did a lot better on the day that they took their ADHD medication. So I guess all to say that it is really tricky to kind of discuss with a 13-year-old who feels like it's not helpful. And I think my recommendation there is probably to do something like what Dr. DeVito said, of like, starting with connection, right? Let's start with connection before correction, right? Of like, how do we connect on this? How do we look for the kernels of truth that are there for that 13-year-old of, yeah, you don't want to take your medicine. Okay, tell me about that. What is it about it? Is it makes you feel different? You don't like the side effects? Is it something you have to remember? Like, is there a way that we can, like, maybe could we get some data on this? Like, okay, you say it doesn't help you. Is there a way, like, what could we look for? Let's do a little experiment. Like, what would we look for that would show us that maybe it is helping or it's not helping? I think that, yeah, those are some of the ideas off the top of my head. I mean, I do think also finding other people besides you as the parent potentially for her to talk to, whether it be a therapist or pediatrician or someone else who might be able to talk a little bit. Sometimes coming from another person can be helpful too, besides the parent.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. Are there resources? I'm sorry, that one we kind of covered already. Let's see, let's go to this one. Um, in terms of societal cues that our girls may or may not have, how might you help a girl with their difficulty in building relationships or maintaining friendships? What strategies might you share there?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, around social skill building. So there's sort of like there could be a range of things to think about here. I mean, there's sort of on one end of the spectrum, there are interventions around social skills, building social skills. So these are kind of like social skills groups or social skills training. And certainly there are professionals in our area in North Carolina, and probably if there's people who are calling from elsewhere. So there's kind of like didactic interventions where they actually practice, this is what you could say, right? Or this is what you could notice, or it sounds like maybe there's another way to think about that, like that kind of level. I think, steps down from that are trying to think about, especially if you have a younger kid, younger teen, are there ways that you might be able to establish or set up sort of situations to help her practice? Like, are there, neighbor friends or play dates that you could help facilitate just to have some more opportunities for building social skills and hopefully with somebody who would be, patient and positive. This does get harder as teens get older, right? For a variety of reasons. Teens want to do it themselves, or it's harder to coordinate those play dates. So having conversations, I think, as much as you can with your teams about what they're experiencing. These are also things that could be helpful to talk about with school counselors or other folks that work closely with your daughter. And certainly mental health professionals can also help with this too.
Thank you for that. And you corrected me. I said societal. I meant social skills.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another question. We've always kept our daughter busy working well. However, in keeping her on task and out of trouble. However, we're heading to middle school with greater school demands, extracurriculars. How do we know when it's too much, in regards to executive function skills and abilities that they have?
Yeah, so I think that's a great observation. And I don't think there's any one answer or tipping point. I think this is a matter of like, oh, we're going to try this and we're going to learn from it. So maybe we keep up with our extracurriculars, but when we start to observe like where are the struggles, I think it becomes like a conversation and a checking in. So maybe it is like that sort of weekly family meeting for a little while as we make this transition and say, how'd that week go? How did it feel for you? I have one kid who thrives on go, 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 and another who doesn't. I understand that. And it's even within one family, what works for one child might not work for another. So I think it's a lot of checking in, family meetings. Dr. Peg Dawson also has like an executive function skills questionnaire like on their website and things like that. So you could even do a baseline, like what are my child's strengths and what are their challenges, to kind of get a baseline and then see like, uh-oh, are the things that they're usually really good at starting to maybe struggle more because maybe they are getting overtaxed. But I really think it's an observation and a conversation, um, maybe week to week.
Think it's also a time you can practice some of those like prioritizing skills. So if there literally isn't enough time in the day, you can have your kid make a list. You can say, what's your top thing? What's your bottom thing? And that's something I used a lot. Like my mom would have me sit down. She's like, you need to do this because you have too much stuff going on. And that's just like a fact. But it's not like phasing it all out at once. It's like doing actually what matters to your child and not like just to fill the space because there isn't the space anymore.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, especially providing that real world hands-on experience, Mela. With consistent behavioral therapy, does emotional control tend to significantly improve levels for girls with ADHD?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. So I'm not aware of, so I think an area of in studies on interventions that's really lacking is around emotion regulation. We don't have a really great intervention targeting just emotion regulation. I think it depends on the behavioral therapy you are talking about. I think the behavioral therapies that we mentioned today don't necessarily target emotion regulation or emotional control. The behavioral therapy that does come to mind where that is much more of a component is something called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, which is a kind of CBT. That is not necessarily for girls with ADHD, although certainly you could have ADHD and do that kind of intervention. And they do have an arm of their treatment that is focused more on emotion regulation skills. But in terms of, the kinds of therapies that I was talking about, that organizational skills training, I don't necessarily think you're going to see that specifically impacting emotional control. Mar, I don't know if you know anything from more of the on executive functioning side. I know you said a couple times this is a particularly, tricky area to target.
Yeah, it is tricky because, like I said, when I'm coaching, it's not something that's really, at least not yet, coming up. It's more something that, might be in the home. And again, if we have girls who are masking and things like that, then it might only be showing up a lot at home. And then it becomes, how do we support the parent? So maybe it means the parent getting support to manage their stress level, to manage their emotions around their daughter being triggered and things like that. And then maybe getting some sort of support together. Just a slow growing of skills over.
Okay.
That's just a guess.
What?
Yeah.
Our last question, what accommodations or specialized services can schools provide in an IEP to help support IEP to help support students in high school who struggle with metacognition?
Well, maybe I'll talk about a little bit around ADHD, and then Mara, I don't know if you have anything to add to the metacognition. So I mean, it's a another really great question, and you know, I think. I'm going back to some of the interventions that we know that could be woven into an IEP or 504. I mentioned that daily report card, right? And so this is again is a list, a small list of behaviors that students might be working on. Typically, these have to do with things like raising their hand rather than calling out, or they could have more to do around executive functioning skills like turning in assignments on time, or getting started on their work with only so many reminders, things like that. So I could imagine that some tool like that could include something around metacognition. I think you'd probably want to think a little creatively about like what is the behavior you're trying to show. Like, for example, is there like something that the student might be able to indicate that they were thinking a little bit about their process in answering a question. So that's a long way of saying I don't know specifically the answer to this question, but I do wonder if there's some of the tools that we do know that work that could be harnessed and used to support that area. Mara, I don't know if you have any other ideas there.
Yeah, at the moment, I don't have anything else to add. It's something to think a little bit more and do a little more research into that.
Yeah, yeah. I do think that's a great question too. I mean, I think talking to your child's school counselors, school psychologists, the people that support your kids at school, and I know all teachers and school personnel are so busy, but this could be a really, really great question to talk with them and think about what could be available.
Well, Dr. DeVito, Dr. Schechter, and Ms. Gillum, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, as well as resources. Thank you all in our audience for coming. We'll send a follow-up email that include a survey as well as the slide presentation. Again, thank you and have a wonderful night.